Hello all and welcome to another episode of Social Psychology Explained. Today we're going to look at Holding Yourself Captive, Perceptions of Custody During Interviews and Interrogations by Alceste, Luke, and Casson. It was published in the September 2018 issue of the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition. If you'd like to read the article for yourself, check the description down below for a citation and link. But before we get into the article, I would like to remind you, kind viewer, that if you like this content and want to help others learn more about social psychology, you can help me appease the algorithm gnomes by liking and sharing this video, leaving a comment down below, and subscribing to the channel. In 1966, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that police officers were obligated to inform detainees of their rights when being taken into custody. However, many social psychologists have questioned how protective the reading of one's Miranda Rights actually is. And then, in light of the numerous convictions that have been overturned thanks to DNA evidence, increased scrutiny has been directed towards police interrogations. As a result, half of the states in the U.S. now require that all interviews and interrogations be video recorded. While these measures hopefully help protect individuals in police custody, how exactly do we operationalize custody in the first place? Over the years, the courts have struggled with this, and in Miranda v. Arizona, the Supreme Court defined custodial interrogation as questioning initiated by law enforcement officers after a person has been taken into custody or otherwise deprived of his freedom of action in any significant way. Then, in Orozco v. Texas, the court determined that formal arrest is absolutely police custody, but not all police interviews and interrogations are conducted after an arrest. So, in Stansbury v. California, the Supreme Court ruled that police custody depends on the objective circumstances of the interrogation, not on the subjective views harbored by either the interrogating officers or the person being questioned. While no formal list has been adjudicated, this essentially amounts to whether a reasonable person would feel that their freedoms have been restricted in the given situation. Put simply, would a reasonable person feel that they are free to leave? In practice, this distinction of custody plays out in the contrast between police interviews versus police interrogations. Within the framework of the Reid technique, an interview is a non-accusatory form of questioning designed to gather information and determine if they are being truthful or deceptive. In other words, the subject is not presumed guilty and is ostensibly free to leave. In an interrogation, the subject is a suspect and guilt is presumed. Thus, the interaction is far more accusatory, and the goal is to get a confession. But the question remains, do individuals undergoing a police interview really feel more free to leave than those undergoing an interrogation? If not, then we may need to rethink our understanding of police custody. And since no research to date has examined perceptions of custody, the authors conducted 2 experiments to examine this question. Both studies used a 2-phase actor-observer paradigm. In phase 1, participants were brought into the lab and witnessed a supposed wallet theft. They then underwent an interaction with a supposed security officer that varied depending on condition. In phase 2, participants were shown a video of a participant in phase 1 and reacted to it. So, in study 1, the difference of interest was whether individuals feel freer to leave in interviews compared to interrogations. The authors recruited 60 undergraduates who received course credit for their participation and were pre-screened for not having any anxiety disorders. This pre-screening was probably part of the IRB agreement to assure no participant had a particularly adverse reaction to a stressful manipulation. The participants were brought in under the cover story that they would be part of a study about perceptions of autonomy. When they arrived at the lab, they were told that things were running a bit behind schedule and that they should wait in the waiting room while the previous participant finished up. The previous participant, who was actually a Confederate, then returned and the participant and the experimenter went over the consent form. The Confederate returned to the room and left their purse outside. Once they returned, they looked through their purse only to realize that their wallet was missing. After the Confederate left to ostensibly report the missing wallet to campus authorities, the participant entered the lab and another experimenter was introduced as someone doing a different study, and the participant was asked if they could help this other researcher out by participating in a separate study before the actual one. The authors of the paper say that this detour was built in to encourage participants to try to rush through the next stage, and while I understand that motive, I have no idea whether it actually achieved that intended result. 5 minutes following the detour, a male experimenter disguised as a security officer entered the room, introduced himself, and said that he was investigating a missing wallet and wanted to ask the participant a few questions. Participants were randomly assigned to either be interviewed or interrogated, and the male experimenter conducted both interviews and interrogations using the Reid technique. In the interview condition, the guard left the door to the lab open and the experimenter stayed in the room. The questions were also of an open-ended nature. In the interrogation condition, the guard asked the experimenter to speak with him outside for a moment, and when he returned alone, he closed the door. The interrogation then started with an accusatory question, and then continued to try and elicit a confession from the participant. Once the male experimenter left, the main experimenter returned and partially debriefed the participant, explaining that the study was not in fact about autonomy, and would elaborate further after the main questionnaire. The main questionnaire consisted of first a measure of their perceptions of custody and how free they were to leave the interaction with the guard. And second, a manipulation check where the participant responded whether they thought the guard thought they were a witness or a suspect, and whether the guard thought they were guilty or innocent. They were also asked to report why they stayed in the room. Now, Phase 2 was administered over MTurk, which is a platform which allows researchers to recruit participants for their studies, and then to pay said participants through the platform. Phase 2 participants were randomly assigned to view a video of either an interview or an interrogation from Phase 1. After the video, they were asked whether the person was a witness or a suspect, whether the person was guilty or innocent, whether the person was free to leave, and whether the person felt free to leave. Why the MTurker thought the subject felt the way that they did, and then they were asked to imagine that they were the Phase 1 participant and if they would feel free to leave. And now results. First, let's take a look at the manipulation checks from Phase 1. As usual, all graphs are my own creations based on information provided in the paper. Interviews were significantly shorter than interrogations. Participants in the interrogation condition were significantly more likely to report that they felt they were a suspect and that the guard thought they were guilty. Participants were further more likely to report that they felt like they were in custody in the interrogation condition than in the interview condition. On to the juicier bits. There was no significant difference between the number of participants who thought they were free to leave in one condition compared to the other. When asked how free they felt to leave, responses were generally low, and once again there was no significant difference between the groups. When asked whether they thought about leaving the room, few did, and once again no significant differences between the groups. When asked how often they thought about leaving the room, there were no significant differences between groups. Participants generally did not want to leave, though the interrogation group had a greater desire to do so than the interview group. On the converse question about how much they wanted to stay, scores were generally high and did not significantly differ. In examining the qualitative data, the top reasons participants wanted to stay were that they knew they were innocent, that they did not want to appear suspicious by leaving, and that they wanted to help the investigation. For Phase 2 manipulation checks, the MTurkers in the interrogation condition estimated the session as longer than the MTurkers in the interview condition. Phase 2 participants in the interrogation condition were more likely to report that the subject was a suspect compared to those in the interview condition. Across conditions, few Phase 2 observers thought the Phase 1 participant was guilty, and there were no significant differences between conditions. However, those in the interrogation condition were significantly more confident in their assessments. And when looking at the main dependent measures, significantly more observers in the interview condition thought the participant was free to leave than in the interrogation condition. They also thought the Phase 1 actor felt more free to leave in the interview condition than in the interrogation condition. However, when they imagined themselves in the actor's shoes, their perceptions of custody much more closely matched the results from the actors themselves. So in sum, people feel equally captive when they are getting interviewed versus interrogated. However, outside observers do think the subject of the interaction will feel more captive in interrogation than in an interview unless they are asked to put themselves in the subject's position. Now, I did a few calculations on my own based on information provided in the paper, and it turns out that Phase 1 of this study was severely underpowered to detect the non-significant effects it found. In other words, it did not contain nearly enough participants to find statistically significant differences between their conditions. However, this isn't necessarily a problem. For this particular issue, do we really care about a difference we can only detect in a sample of a few hundred? If you are setting policy for police departments or adjudicating a court case, you may need a really strong effect to be able to say that perceptions are in fact different in interviews versus interrogations. For Study 2, Alceste et al. Sought to further examine the interview condition and test the Supreme Court assumption that specifically advising an individual that they are free to leave will ensure that they do in fact feel that they are not in custody. This experiment mimics Study 1 but with a single key difference. Phase 1 participants in both conditions underwent an interview, but in the experimental condition they were told that they were free to leave, and in the control condition they were not. So here are the demographics of both Phase 1 and Phase 2 samples. I just want to point out that in-person experiments are a lot more difficult to recruit participants for, and thus typically have smaller and less representative sample sizes, and studies and experiments delivered online. And now, Phase 1 results. Interviews with the advisement were on average 1 minute longer than those without. Participants who were instructed they were free to leave were significantly more likely to indicate that they were a witness than those who were not so instructed. However, the groups did not differ in the extent to which they perceived that the guard thought they were guilty. Participants who were told they were free to leave were significantly more likely to indicate that they were free to leave, but did not actually feel freer to leave than the group who was not advised as such. Participants in both conditions had low ratings on how much they thought about leaving and wanted to leave, and there were no significant differences between the groups. On to Phase 2 results. Most observers believed the Phase 1 participant to be innocent, and there were no significant differences between conditions. Also of interest, even though the interactions were non-accusatory, a majority of Phase 2 participants thought the Phase 1 participant was a suspect, and this did not vary by condition. Similarly to the previous study, observers significantly differed by condition on whether they felt the subject was free to leave. However, this difference disappeared when the Phase 2 participants were asked to imagine they were the Phase 1 participant. So what do we take away from all this? I think the big finding here is that when speaking with persons of authority, people generally don't feel free to leave, even when they are specifically advised that they are. We should also consider the fact that outside observers are much more affected by the tone of the interview and advisements of freedom to leave than actors. However, this difference seems to largely disappear when observers are specifically asked to imagine that they are the subject. I would hope this would inform jury procedure in future court proceedings. Incidentally, this finding provides support for the use of make-believe scenarios delivered through online surveys as effective manipulations and simulations of real-world behavior. However, the interactions involved in these two studies were fairly artificial, and not necessarily representative of real-life police interviews and interrogations. But I think if anything, the manipulation outlined in this paper is a lot friendlier than the modal police interaction. So I would argue that if even in the best-case scenario, people still don't feel free to leave, then in situations that are generally more hostile, people will feel even more captive. Regular viewers of the channel will probably also wonder how I feel about the exclusive use of ad hoc measures in this study. As usual, I'm not happy about it, but considering the fact that there probably aren't any existing measures that do what the authors needed, and the fact that the results tell a consistent story across two different studies, I'm willing to let it slide. It should also be noted that across both studies, not a single participant actually tried to leave the interaction. Well, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. And if you've got a paper you'd like me to dissect next, or more thoughts on this one, let me know in the comments.